Hello, everyone, and welcome to Magma Rage's episode 56. I'm joined, as usual, by Pandemonia, and we're right in the middle of the Witchwood reveal cycle at the moment, but we've been doing a lot of videos coming out pretty much daily or every second day as there's enough cards, giving our first impressions of the cards. So instead of having a 2-hour podcast here rehashing all of that, we're going to keep that stuff to the separate videos. So please check those out if you want to find more about our first impressions of any of the cards. Instead, today we're just going to talk about some Hearthstone fundamentals, and we're going to focus on our Magma Rage's tip segment for today. So our Magma Rage's tip today, we're going to be going back to basics. We're going to be looking at tempo and value and what these two terms mean and how you can make the best use of them. So from a board perspective, first of all, if we look at tempo and value, tempo is about the board state and being in the best state on the board, and value is generally about all the resources that are available to you outside of just the board state sometimes. So let's maybe talk first a bit about value. So Pandemonia, do you want to give us maybe a more in-depth definition of value?
Okay, so value, to put it very basic, it's like you said, it's resources, and in the context of Hearthstone, it's about getting the most out of your cards. So one of the most commonly associated terms with getting the most out of your cards is what, if you knew, you might have heard people talk about card advantage. And if you just look at the term straight off the bat, card advantage, it's pretty much, very simply put, it translates to that, having more cards than your opponent. The whole concept being that if you have more cards than your opponent, it translates to you essentially have more resources and options than your opponent.
Yep.
So it's basically, if your opponent has 4 cards in their hand, you have 5 cards in your hand, and there's nothing on board, you would basically say you have card advantage because you're 1 card ahead. That's obviously the most simplistic. In terms of how to get that card advantage, I mean, a good example of a card like this is the basic rogue card, Sprint. It costs 7 mana, and it just simply says draw 4 cards.
Yeah.
So if you do simple arithmetic, you've used 1 card, so that's -1, but you've gained 4. So essentially, you will have netted 3 cards.
Yeah.
That's the simple maths of that particular example.
Yeah, which puts you 3 cards better, versus your opponent when it comes to card advantage as well.
Yeah. Then other sort of a little bit more, shall we say, a little bit more trickier, because Sprint is quite an easy concept to understand. You draw cards, cool, I've got more cards. But one of the some of the other situations which are a little bit more complicated to understand, and one of the more common ones is AoE, or area of effect spells.
Yeah.
So the most common one that every new player when they start out probably hates the most when you ask new players is Flame Strike. Mm-hmm. The 7 mana mage spell that says deal 4 damage to all enemy minions.
Yeah.
So this card is usually card advantage, because what happens is most of the times you're killing more than one of your opponent's minions. Yeah. So let's say you're killing 4 of your opponent's minions. That's essentially 4 cards that they've played, and you've used 1 card. So you've lost 1 card, they've lost 4 cards. So you've gained a virtual card advantage of 3, essentially.
Mm-hmm. So that's kind of often summarized in a term people say, like, I'm 2 for 1-ing my opponent, or I don't want to get 2 for 1. It's those kind of
So when you say 2
comparisons.
for 1, it means, let's say if I 2 for 1 my opponent, it means they've used 2 cards, I've only used 1.
Yeah.
And another instance where that can happen, and this is why these cards are sort of, a lot of the times, a newer player trap, are what we call buff cards. So, simplest example is Blessing of Kings. A lot of different classes have different forms of them.
Yeah.
And sometimes they are used with very good effect, but the major issue with them is because you're putting that buff onto a minion, you've essentially committed 2 cards, and let's say your opponent uses 1 spell to kill that minion that you've put the buff on. They've essentially, you would say they've 2 for 1'd you. The
Because they
main way
managed to kill the buff plus the card that the buff was originally on.
the main way you negate this is by obviously using that buffed minion to kill other minions.
Yeah.
So that's obviously where the trade-off happens. That's why you will almost never see top players ever play a minion and buff it the same turn. They will only usually buff it when they're actually going to get the trade, so that at least kind of negates part of it. And then any additional trade they get from that is obviously more card advantage.
Yeah.
So those are sort of the basic. I mean, that's, when we talk about value and card advantage, that's generally what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Another aspect of value, which is sometimes a bit difficult for newer players to wrap their heads around, because, they get told, the first thing they get told is, okay, you lose the game when you reach 0 health.
Yeah.
So a lot of players will try to do their utmost to try to keep their health total as high as possible, like especially when it comes to using weapons and things like that. And that's your health pool, so in Hearthstone you start on 30 health and you lose when you go to 0. But the best way to think of health is not a win or lot. It is a win condition or lose condition, but the best way to think of it is actually as a resource.
Yeah.
And what that resource usually translates to is a time. And especially if anyone, especially in slower control decks, what you do is you will just wait a lot of the times, and you'll let your opponent hit you because that's buying you extra time, in order then, like we mentioned previously with the AoE spells, that you will then be able to maximize and get more value out of your AoEs. So, and this is also sometimes it's very difficult, that you might want to hold back instead of flame striking, let's say just 3 small minions now. Try and maybe bait your opponent to play more minions. They overextend, and then you get a much bigger, you get more card advantage.
Yeah.
But a lot of it comes with, it's about balancing it, right? Because, like, you can't get too greedy because sometimes you might just die.
Yeah. I mean, as you mentioned, that use of AoE to, get more card advantage, and using your health to kind of bait your opponent into giving your AoE more card advantage is another way of kind of turning the resource of health into the resource of card advantage, which is an interesting way to think about cards. Interesting way to think about your health total.
Yeah. And but the risk there is obviously is that you still got to remember that if you reach 0 health, you do lose. So you can't use, and part of it is also knowing against different classes and different decks how low is good enough. It's still safe.
Yeah.
And,
how low can you go?
Exactly. So a good example is like against hunters, for example. You've always got to worry about, first of all, their hero power as well as cards like Kill Command. Whereas against the class like Priest, for example, you can actually be like excluding combo shenanigans and things. In terms of spell burst, you can actually go quite low without worrying about dying. Because they don't have a lot of spells that deal a lot of burst damage, and a lot of decks play cards like Mind Blast.
Yeah.
So that's kind of part of knowing how low can you go, and each class is different. How low you can go.
Yeah, and there's kind of a flip side to health as a resource as well. If you don't have enough health, if you're sitting on like 1 health against a priest, you still have to make sure you clear everything, which means that you're going to be, using your cards inefficiently. You can't wait with your flame strike because your health is too low, so you end up just flame striking like a single minion, and that's obviously really bad for value. So it's kind of a balance in that sense. And there's some cards that can help you kind of restore health as well. And those can be useful kind of value tools in an odd way.
Yeah, so like cards like Healing Touch, the basic Druid spell, which says 3 mana, restore 8 health. So like if you restore 8 health to your face, like it's you got to weigh out if it's worth it, because just by restoring the 8 health, you've gained that extra bit of time. But if your opponent's got massive minions and massive board, that won't really help you because they're just going to take it away immediately.
Yeah, and that's kind of where the concept of tempo kind of comes into things, right? So Healing Touch is good for your resource. You kind of, in this case, you're turning a card into a health resource by healing your hero, or you can also heal a minion. But just talking about the context of healing a hero, that's kind of an anti-tempo play. You're not really affecting the board in any kind of positive way. And that's really what tempo is about. It's all about the current board state and making the best use of it and the cards at your disposal to get as much of an advantage on the board as possible. So some good cards to kind of illustrate this. First of all, we can look at Fire Elemental. This is a really good example because Fire Elemental is a minion, so it has a presence on the board inherently. And it also has a battle cry that deals 3 damage. So this can help you remove an opponent's minion, which is kind of some of the biggest tempo swings you can get in Hearthstone are when you're able to remove your opponent's minions and generate your own, because you're doing both sides. You're affecting both sides of the board simultaneously. You're removing stuff from their side of the board and managing to develop your side of the board. And that's really what tempo comes down to. It's all about this board advantage. It's the micro game of how do I get as far ahead on board here so that I can leverage my other resources, in order to win the game. So if you're very far ahead on board, you can apply more pressure to your opponent, and that can force them to have to use their resources in an inefficient way, for instance. Another really good card that pretty much exemplifies tempo is Sap. So Sap is a rogue spell, returns an enemy minion to your opponent's hand. So you can see clearly this isn't really helping card advantage. You're using a whole card and you're actually just returning a card back to their hand. So in no way are they really losing a card. They're just losing tempo because that card is no longer on the board anymore. They're going to have to use mana to play that card again. Whereas you've kind of gained tempo because you've affected the board. And hopefully with Sap, you usually use it on bigger minions. Let's say 4 or greater cost, those kind of minions where you can actually get a tempo advantage. One of the nicest things about Sap is that it's quite cheap. So you can actually play other cards the same turn you play Sap. So whilst it doesn't have a body attached to it like Fire Elemental does, you can play another minion alongside it. You can play an Edwin Van Cleef. You can play just a 4 mana 4/4, a 5 mana 5/5. And in that case, it kind of provides you a big tempo advantage.
Just the important thing, though, to note about Sap is, like you said, but if you look at it purely, it's actually technically card disadvantage because you are actually simply... You as a player playing Sap are using a card, so you're -1, and your opponent's card, you're not actually getting rid of it. It's going back to their hand. So, like if you look at it from the value point of view, it's the complete opposite of value because you are simply losing a card.
Yeah.
Whereas, and this is obviously outweighed by all these things you mentioned, where the time and the fact that you are getting ahead on board is what compensates for that.
Yeah, and one of the key things with tempo is knowing when to use resources like this. If you just use your Sap and you don't develop anything at the same time, then you're just going to be throwing away cards for basically nothing, right? Because as you mentioned, it doesn't really affect the card advantage. You need to actually be able to make good use of your tempo tools like this at the right time, which is a very important aspect of these kind of tempo tools, especially the ones that aren't, attached to bodies like Fire Elemental. And there's kind of another form of another concept that's really important to discuss when discussing tempo and value, and that's actually value trading. So what is value trading, Pandemonia?
So it's a concept that if you've ever watched any competitive streams, like any of the HET events, a lot of the time the casters will say, oh, he's going to value trade, or oh no, he's not going to value trade. So value trading simply is when you use your minion to kill your opponent's minion, but your minion lives.
Yeah.
So in the simplest example, it's your 3/3 killing their 1/3. It's it's your 5/5 killing their 3/5. It's simply you using your minion to kill theirs, and it doesn't trade in the sense that both don't die. The idea is that yours lives and your opponent's dies. So in that way, it kind of ties into the whole concept of card advantage because you've used your minion's still in place, so you haven't really used the full card yet, whereas your opponent has lost a whole card.
Yeah. So then you can still maybe attack with that minion next turn, or your opponent has to use another resource from their hand in order to actually kill the minion. So you've kind of 2-for-1 your opponent in a way, because you've either killed 2 minions on the board with it, or you've forced them to use a removal plus already having killed 1 minion on the board.
Yeah, and just important to note is even forcing them to use something like their hero power, you can actually consider that to be using a resource because that's 2 mana. So the fact that you might force them to use that 2 mana also puts them a bit behind in tempo because now they basically have to play with 2 mana less.
Yeah, hero powers are actually a really interesting side of Hearthstone when it comes to value and tempo. That's very different to a lot of other card games because they're something that's always available to you. They're generally costed in a way such that they're very bad tempo. 2 mana for 1 damage is very bad tempo, but it's great card advantage when you can make good use of it because you're not actually having to use a physical card from your hand or from your deck, right? So, hero powers like the mage one in particular are great examples of trading or of a good value hero power that's bad for tempo. Whereas something like the rogue hero power, that hero power you can set up to use on the next turn because it's a weapon, so it kind of banks tempo in a way and allows you to make more... to do more in following turns.
Yeah, definitely. So like we said, the examples of value train, but then, like with most things, there's always about knowing when to do it and when not. So, if we tell you what value train is, it sounds great and it sounds like something you want to always be doing. But the important thing to note about value trading and, the situations that come up, it's especially comes down because when you're value trading, your minion obviously is taking damage.
Yeah.
And so what happens is obviously that damage, it's very possible, can put it low enough where it puts it in range of, these various AoE spells we've talked about. Whether it's Flame Strike, whether it's Consecration, whether it's Defile, there's a whole lot of other considerations. So sometimes it might actually be better to, instead of value trade, let's say your 5/5 into their 3/3, it might be better just to trade your 3/3 away so that you're not vulnerable to Hellfire. You're not vulnerable to
Flame Strike.
And that's kind of what you've always got to weigh up.
Yeah, that's a really key point to make. It's very important with any of these kind of rules you have in a game, rule of thumbs at least, let's say, the best ways to play the game to realize when you should not be doing that, right? Sometimes Fire Elemental has to go face. Sometimes that's the best play to assert, let's say, an advantage, even though it's not really making the best use of it as a tempo tool. And in that case, sometimes also just trading off your minions, as you give that example, trading a 3/3 into a 3/3 instead of value trading with your 5/5, that can help you play around all kinds of 4 damage, targeted spells from any given class, like Eviscerate from Rogue, and as well it can help you play around a lot of AoE, Flame Strike, Hellfire, all those kind of cards you mentioned. So it's very important to know when to kind of break those rules of thumb, and yeah, with value trading in particular, that can be a bit tricky. It can often come down to reads on your opponent and whatnot. Yeah. But how to make reads in that's a bit of a more advanced discussion that we'll definitely have in a future Magma Rages episode. But I think we've kind of covered most of what you really need to know about value and tempo. Feel free to ask us in the comments or by tweeting at us if you have any more questions. No question is too noob when it comes to Hearthstone. We're very willing to answer any questions. But before we go, we do obviously have our esports segment as well. There isn't really much to report on the esports front at the moment. We've just concluded the kind of first season, as we mentioned before. The playoffs are going to be coming up from the 5th of May. 5th and 6th of May will be Europe, and then every weekend after that will be the next region. So then it'll be Americas and then Asia Pacific. So make sure you keep an eye out for those. They're going to be some of the first big tournaments after Witchwood. We'll see 1 or 2... I think there's 1 tour stop before then, which will also be pretty indicative of how the meta is going to shape up post-Witchwood, post the rotation. But they're definitely going to be very interesting to watch, as the meta is still going to be very much in flux at the time we get to that point, I imagine. So yeah, that's all we have for this episode. Quite a short one. Once again, if you want to find out more about the Witchwood cards, please check out the YouTube, and you can subscribe to make sure you're keeping right up to date as we're releasing new first impression videos. And you can also follow us on Twitter. I tend to tweet out a lot of the cards as well. And you can find Pandemonia at PandemoniaZA and myself at Dib_gaming. So thanks a lot, everyone, for tuning in. Until next week, cheerio.
Cheerio.